They had already been told it was impossible, not by the enemy, by their own commanders. Staff Sergeant Bill Dreher, 24 years old, 2nd Ranger Battalion, Company D, a man trained to do things that weren't supposed to be possible, was climbing a hill that military planners had looked at on a map, shaken their heads, and quietly decided to assign to someone else. Hill 400. 400 meters of near vertical slope rising from the Hurtgen Forest floor like a clenched fist. German held, German fortified, defended at the top by SS paratroopers, the Fallschirmjager, considered among the most elite fighting men in the entire Wehrmacht. Men who had been told this hill would never fall. Men who were right to believe it. And Dreher was 60 meters from the top, in broad daylight, with no artillery support, no air cover, and a company of Rangers behind him that had started the morning with 65 men. He didn't know how many were still climbing. He was afraid to look back. There's a reason military historians call the Battle of Hill 400 one of the most savage small unit actions of the entire Second World War. Not because of the scale, not because of the strategic importance, but because of what it asked of the men who fought it. It asked them to do something that every instinct, every calculation, every reasonable assessment of the situation said was suicide. And they did it anyway. This is the story of what happened on December 7th, 1944, exactly 3 years after Pearl Harbor, when 85 American Rangers attacked a fortified hilltop held by German paratroopers, and what it cost them to take it. To understand Hill 400, you first have to understand what it meant to be a Ranger in December 1944. The 2nd Ranger Battalion was not a conventional unit. It had been built from the ground up to operate where conventional units couldn't. The selection process had eliminated the majority of volunteers before training even began. The men who remained were self-selecting for a specific combination of qualities that defined easy description: physical endurance beyond the normal human range, the psychological capacity to function under sustained extreme pressure, and a particular, almost pathological resistance to the word impossible. They had been trained at Camp Forest, Tennessee, and then at the British Commando School in Scotland, where British instructors who had already seen the war at its worst had put them through scenarios designed not to teach them tactics, but to reveal who they were underneath the tactics. Some men broke, most didn't. The ones who didn't became Rangers. Their motto was simple: Rangers lead the way. 3 words. 3 words that, in practice, meant the Rangers went first, into the worst terrain, against the hardest objectives, with the least support. The 2nd Ranger Battalion had scaled the cliffs at Point Duac on D-Day, one of the most audacious assaults in the history of warfare. They had fought through the Brest campaign, through the Siegfried Line penetrations. By December 1944, they were operating in the Hurtgen Forest, which meant they had gone from one of the worst combat environments on the planet to the single worst combat environment on the planet. Sergeant Bill Dreher had been in the Rangers since the beginning, age 24, from a small town in rural Ohio, Findlay, a place of flat fields and grain elevators and no hills whatsoever, which made him either the wrong man or exactly the right man for what was about to happen. He was not physically imposing, medium height, lean the way men get when they've been burning more calories than they can replace for months. He had a habit of moving very quietly, which his fellow Rangers found unnerving until they realized it wasn't an affectation. It was trained reflex, the habit of a man who had been operating in environments where sound got you killed. His limitation, and every man had one, the Ranger training made you knew yours, was control. He needed to know the plan. He needed to understand the objective. He needed to see the whole shape of what he was being asked to do. When the plan fell apart, which in the Hurtgen it always did, Dreher had to consciously, deliberately suppress the urge to stop and reassess, to force himself to keep moving through the chaos, even when the chaos made no sense. He knew this about himself. He would need it on December 7th. Now, the other side. The men at the top of Hill 400, Fallschirmjager, German paratroopers. In the hierarchy of German military units in 1944,
the Fallschirmjager occupied a peculiar and deadly position. They were no longer primarily used as paratroopers. The massive airborne operations of the early war had bled their ranks, and Germany no longer had air superiority sufficient to mount such operations. But the Fallschirmjager had not been disbanded. They had been redeployed as elite infantry, used to hold the most critical positions, assigned to the counterattacks that other units couldn't execute, sent to the places where the line was breaking. The men holding Hill 400 were from the 272nd Volksgrenadier Division, stiffened by Fallschirmjager units that had been fighting continuously since Normandy. They were exhausted, they were under strength, and they were standing on the most defensively perfect terrain position in the entire Hurtgen Forest. Because Hill 400, Bergstein Hill in German military maps, was not just a hill, it was the high ground that controlled everything. The 2nd Ranger Battalion trained harder than most people will ever train in their lives. They went first into the worst places with the least support on the hardest missions. And most people watching this video right now had never heard of them before today. That's not their fault, that's ours. If you're not subscribed yet, fix that right now. These men deserve more than anonymity. Subscribe. It takes 2 seconds. It took them everything.
Here is what Hill 400 actually was. From the summit on a clear day, and there were almost no clear days in the Hurtgen in December, you could see from miles the Rohr River Valley, the road networks that were the arteries of any Allied advance into Germany, the surrounding forest floor where American units were moving, resupplying, staging, which meant that whoever held Hill 400 could direct artillery onto everything below it. And the Germans had observers on that summit with a direct line to their artillery batteries. Every American movement within visual range of Hill 400 was being watched. Every supply convoy, every troop movement, every attempt to advance on the Rohr River, the next major obstacle on the road to Germany's heartland. The hill wasn't just a defensive position, it was a pair of eyes that could call down death on anything it saw. The 8th Infantry Division had been trying to take Hill 400 for weeks. They had taken serious casualties in the attempt. The hill had repelled every assault, in part because the German observers could watch the Americans assembling their attack, call in artillery on the staging areas, and disrupt the assault before it even began. The 8th Infantry Division's commander looked at his casualty reports and made a decision. He called for the Rangers. The briefing given to Captain George Williams, commanding Company D of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, was delivered on the evening of December 6, 1944. The objective, Hill 400. The method, direct assault up the slope. The support available, limited artillery preparation. No guaranteed air support, the weather was marginal. No additional infantry to exploit any breakthrough. The timeline, attack at dawn, December 7th. Williams listened to the briefing. He asked 3 questions. He received 3 answers that were, in their way, honest. We don't have a better route. We don't have more time. We don't have more men. He nodded. He went back to his company and briefed them. He told them what they were going to do. He told them about the slope, near vertical in places, frozen, covered in snow that gave way without warning to ice beneath. He told them about the Fallschirmjager at the top. He told them about the German bunkers that ringed the summit. He told them the artillery prep would be the best the division could provide, but that once the barrage lifted and they moved, they would be crossing open slope under direct German observation and fire, and there was nothing to be done about that. Then he said, "Rangers, lead the way." Nobody had any questions. What Williams did not tell them, because he didn't know, was that the German command had received intelligence about the Rangers. Not complete, not precise, but enough. A captured American soldier from a different unit had been interrogated through the night of December 6th. He didn't know about the Rangers specifically, but he knew there was an assault planned on Bergstein Hill. He knew it was happening at first light. The German commander on Hill 400, Hauptmann Ernst Kessler, had used the night hours well. He had repositioned his automatic weapons to cover the most likely approach routes. He had registered his mortars on the slope itself, pre-setting elevation and direction, so his crews could fire accurately without observing, just drop the rounds in and adjust. He had pulled every available man back from the forward positions on the slope and consolidated them at the summit. accepting that he would yield the lower slope easily in order to create a killing ground at the point where the attacking force would be most exhausted, most exposed, and farthest from any cover. It was the correct decision. Tactically, it was almost perfect. And Kessler had done one more thing. He had called his men together before dawn and spoken to them. He had told them that what was coming up that hill in the morning was the American Rangers. He had told them what that meant, and he had looked at his Fallschirmjager and seen in their faces not fear, but something he recognized and respected because it was the same thing he felt himself: professional anticipation. Two elite forces about to meet at the worst possible place. One of them wasn't going to walk away the same. 58 men didn't walk off that hill. If stories like this disappear, so do they. Subscribing takes 1 second. What they gave took everything.
December 7th, 1944, 7 a.m. The artillery preparation began. American guns, 105mm and 155mm howitzers, positioned in the valley below, opened up on Hill 400, walking shells up the slope in a methodical pattern designed to suppress defenders, destroy fortifications, cut communication wire, and produce the psychological effect that sustained bombardment always produced in even the most hardened soldiers: the primal need to get underground and stay there. The barrage lasted 20 minutes. It was, by the standards of what the Army could bring to bear in this sector, substantial. It was not enough. Because the German bunkers on Hill 400 had been built with overhead cover capable of surviving direct hits from 105mm shells. The Fallschirmjager went into those bunkers when the barrage started, sat in the dark and the concussion and the rattling earth, and waited. They had done this before, in Normandy, in Paris, in a dozen places between there and here. The barrage ending was the signal that the infantry was coming. It was, for experienced defenders, almost a relief. At 7:20 a.m., the barrage lifted. Captain Williams raised his arm. 85 Rangers started moving toward the base of Hill 400.
The first thing that went wrong was the smoke. Williams had requested a smoke screen to cover the approach across the open ground at the base of the hill. The smoke was supposed to reduce German observation and limit direct fire on the Rangers while they covered the most exposed section of the approach. The wind shifted. Not dramatically, not completely, just enough. The smoke drifted south instead of north. Instead of screening the Ranger advance, it screened nothing, thinning and dispersing against the wind before it reached the relevant ground. The Rangers crossed open ground in full view of the German positions. The German machine guns opened up within 40 seconds of the barrage lifting. 3 Rangers went down in the first minute. Williams didn't stop. He couldn't. Stopping on open ground under machine gun fire was worse than moving. You moved through the beaten zone or you died in it. You never stopped. He ran. Behind him, 82 Rangers ran. On the summit, Kessler watched through binoculars. The smoke had been a gift. He had been worried about it. A well-placed screen would have given the Rangers cover for the critical first 200 meters, the section where his fields of fire were longest and most effective. Instead, he had clear observation. He watched the Rangers moving. He noted the speed, faster than regular infantry, much faster. He noted the formation, loose, spread wide, difficult to mass fire on without exposing flanks. He noted how few went down under his initial fire relative to how many he would have expected. He watched one Ranger take a round and go down, roll behind a depression in the ground, and get up again, still moving. He lowered his binoculars. Increase the mortar rate, he told his runner, and tell the machine gun teams to switch targets every 15 seconds. Don't let them identify the positions. Then he picked up his Kar 98 rifle. If they were going to reach the top, and his instinct said they might, he intended to be there when they did. Sergeant Dreher was 40 meters into the slope when the mortar rounds began falling. The pre-registered concentrations were landing in a pattern that managed to feel both random and inevitable, like the mountain itself was rejecting them. One round landed 8 meters to his left, and he felt the pressure wave before he heard the explosion, a physical shove that staggered him sideways. He kept moving. The slope here was approximately 45 degrees, not quite hands and knees climbing, but close. The frozen ground gave uncertain purchase. Each step had to be tested before trusting it, which slowed everything, which extended the time in the killing ground. He was aware, in a peripheral way, of sound to his left and right. Other rangers, breathing, scrambling, the occasional short burst of profanity when a foothold gave way. He was not aware of which of those sounds were still attached to living men. He didn't look.
He had learned in the Hurtgen not to look. You looked forward, always forward. Anything else slowed you down. And on this slope, slowing down was dying. Sergeant Randall Oakes, Dreher's squad leader, a 28-year-old former high school football coach from Indiana who had the kind of physical presence that made men naturally follow him, was hit at the 50-meter mark. Not a fatal wound. A round through the meat of his left thigh that went in one side and out the other without hitting the femoral artery. Lucky medically. Unlucky tactically. Because Oakes was the man who was supposed to organize the final assault on the summit bunkers. He went down. He stayed down for 30 seconds. And this is important, those 30 seconds. And then he got up. He used his rifle as a crutch. He kept climbing. The men around him saw this. They were already moving. They didn't need the example to keep moving. But they saw it anyway. Stored it somewhere deep where things like this get stored. And the climb became slightly less about individual survival and slightly more about something that had no clean military term. About not being the man who stopped when Oakes didn't. About not being the one who made that choice. They kept climbing. Here is the question nobody was asking at the time, because there wasn't time to ask it. What happens when two groups of men, each trained to be the best, each believing themselves capable of things other soldiers can't do, each committed to a position with no exit option, collide at the top of a frozen hill at 9 in the morning? Not in a movie, not in a war room, in the mud and ice and blood, at the top of a slope they've both just spent 20 minutes fighting through. What happens in the next 60 seconds decides the battle. Not the strategy, not the commanders, not the artillery. The next 60 seconds. And it begins right now. Subscribe, like, and comment. At the 70-meter mark, the character of the slope changed. The lower section had been open, painful, exposed, murderous. The upper section was broken. Boulders, tree stumps blasted flat by the artillery prep, shell craters that provided sudden, precious cover. The Rangers reached the broken ground and the tempo of the battle shifted. Where they had been running, desperately, directly, trying to minimize time in the open, now they could move in bounds, short rushes from one piece of cover to the next, the classic fire and movement that Ranger training had drilled into them until it was reflex. One man fires, one man moves, switch. In the brutal arithmetic of infantry combat, this reduced the attrition rate, not to zero. Nothing on this slope was reducing anything to zero, but enough that men who had expected to die crossing the lower slope were now looking up and realizing they were going to reach the top, that the impossible thing was possible, that they were going to be at the summit in minutes. Dreher had covered 30 meters of broken ground when he nearly ran into the wire. German barbed wire strung between tree stumps, invisible in the shadow of a rock formation until he was 2 feet from it. He stopped. Behind him, Private First Class Eddie Kowalski, 19 years old, from Chicago, the youngest man in Dreher's fire team, stopped a fraction of a second later. Dreher swept the wire slowly, checking the extent, looking for a gap. The German machine gun that had been firing at the slope below had gone silent. He didn't know why. Changing barrels, out of ammunition, moving position, crew dead? He had 3 seconds of quiet to deal with the wire. He pulled his wire cutters. First snip, the tripwire, diffused. Second snip, the barbed strand. Third snip, another strand. He widened the gap carefully, methodically, then gestured Kowalski through, then followed himself. 7 seconds total. 7 seconds that felt like 7 minutes. Behind him, other Rangers were finding the same wire at different points. Some were cutting through, some were finding gaps, some were going over the top, not the recommended approach, but the fastest. One man went over and caught his boot. He fell. The fall pulled him sideways, and he started to roll. He caught a tree root with his hands. He stopped.
He looked down the slope he just climbed. Then he looked up at the summit, 20 meters above. He got up and kept moving.
Williams was at the 80-meter mark. He was aware that his assault had fragmented, not broken, not stopped, but stretched thin across the face of the hill as men navigated the obstacles and the terrain at their own pace. The tight assault formation the plan had called for had been replaced by something messier, more organic, more human. Small groups of 2 and 3, moving independently but in the same direction, toward the same point, toward the summit. He was also aware that he had not heard from his flanking element in 4 minutes. The plan had called for a second group, 15 Rangers under Sergeant First Class Thomas Herring, to move around the north flank of the hill and hit the summit from a different angle simultaneously. The hope was that German defenders caught between 2 assault forces would be forced to split their fire and attention. Williams had heard Herring's element engaging on the flank. Then he had heard nothing. He didn't know if Herring was moving silently or if Herring was dead. He had no way to find out. He had one choice: keep moving. Kessler descended from his forward observation post at the summit's edge when it became clear the Rangers had reached the broken ground. The slope was no longer an advantage. The German machine guns couldn't depress far enough to engage targets in the craters and behind the stumps. The mortar crews were adjusting elevation constantly, trying to track an assault that had fragmented into a dozen small groups that appeared and disappeared between pieces of cover. He had 12 men at the summit in fighting condition. He knew there were significantly more Rangers coming than 12. He ordered his men into a tighter perimeter around the 2 main bunkers, reinforced concrete positions that were his strongest defensive points, the positions the barrage should have destroyed and hadn't. He told them, "The Rangers reach the wire. You fall back to the bunkers and hold." He chambered around in his rifle. He thought briefly and clearly about the distance to the nearest German reinforcement. 12 kilometers, through the forest. No radio contact in the last 40 minutes because the artillery had taken out his antenna. He was alone on this hill. His 12 men against whatever was coming over that wire. He had been in worse situations. He thought about that for a moment and decided that it was probably true, and decided that it didn't particularly help.
December 7th, 1944, 7:54 a.m. 34 minutes after the assault began, the first Rangers reached the summit. Not Dreher, not Williams, a corporal named James Kiefer, 22 years old, from Pittsburgh, a man whose name does not appear in most history books about this battle, which is an injustice, was the first Ranger to physically reach the summit of Hill 400. He came over the final lip of the slope at a dead run because the last 10 meters were too exposed to move carefully through, and he had made the calculation, the right calculation, that speed was better than caution at the final moment. He ran over the top and directly into a German position. The German soldier in that position had his weapon pointed down the slope. Kiefer didn't have time to raise his M1 Garand. He hit the German with his shoulder. They went down together. What happened in the next 4 seconds is not clearly recorded in any official account. Kiefer survived. The German did not. Kiefer got up. He was on the summit of Hill 400. He shouted, his voice carrying back down the slope, the one word the Rangers behind him needed to hear. "Rangers!" What followed was the most intense 4 minutes of the entire battle. Rangers came over the summit in ones and twos, gasping from the climb, lungs burning, legs shaking from the 40-meter sprint up the final slope, and they came directly into German paratroopers who were not running, who were not surrendering, who were fighting the way Fallschirmjager always fought, giving ground only when there was no more ground to give, every step contested, every position held until it was physically untenable. The summit of Hill 400, which was perhaps 60 meters across at its widest point, became something that military historians later called contested ground, and that the men who were on it called unanimously, and without profanity, hell. The distances were measured in feet, in some cases, inches.
German grenades arced from the bunker positions. American grenades answered. Both sides had to be careful. The summit was small enough that an overthrown grenade went down the slope behind you.
Rifles were almost useless at the distances involved. Men used them as clubs in the moments between reloading. They used their hands. They used entrenching tools. Dreher came over the summit 12 seconds after Kiefer. He had a Thompson submachine gun, his preferred weapon since Normandy, accurate enough at these distances, with a fire rate that mattered in close quarters. He fired and moved and fired again, pushing toward the larger of the two bunkers, the one that was still producing fire, the one that was still, somehow, impossibly, manned and fighting. Sergeant Herring's flanking element arrived, not where Williams had expected, not on the north side. Herring had found the north approach blocked, a position Williams didn't know about, couldn't have known about, and had taken his 15 men around the west, a longer route, a route that cost him 12 additional minutes and 2 additional casualties. But he arrived. At 8:59 a.m., 5 minutes after Kiefer's shout, 15 Rangers came over the west edge of the summit, while Dreher's element was engaging from the south. Kessler felt the battle shift the moment they appeared. He was a professional. He understood battlefield geometry. He understood what 2 assault forces from 2 different directions meant for his 12 defenders. He had 3 men left in the main bunker. He had 4 in the secondary position. 5 were dead or out of the fight. He looked at the bunker. He looked at the approaching Rangers from the west. He made a decision. It was not the decision of a man giving up. It was the decision of a man doing the math. He gathered his remaining men. He moved them back to the secondary bunker, the smaller, better protected position on the east side of the summit. He was going to make them pay for every square meter. Williams reached the summit at 8:03 a.m. He counted. He counted twice, moving fast through the summit, checking faces. He had 31 Rangers on the summit. He had started with 85. 54 men in 37 minutes. He stood at the highest point of Hill 400 and looked at the valley below. He could see everything: the Roar River, the roads, the forest paths where American supply convoys moved. He could see exactly why the Germans had fought so hard to keep this position. Then a German mortar round landed 20 meters away, and he stopped thinking about the view. He had a summit. Now he had to hold it. This is where most accounts of the Battle of Hill 400 stop. The Rangers took the hill. Remarkable, inspiring, moving on. But that framing misses the actual story. Taking Hill 400 was not the achievement. Holding it was, because the Germans were not finished. Not even close.
December 7th, 1944, 8:15 a.m. Williams had 12 minutes. 12 minutes from the moment he reached the summit to the moment the German counterattack began. He used every second of them. He sent 4 men to clear the secondary bunker, which, after a short, violent engagement that cost 1 Ranger's left hand and cost the 3 remaining German defenders their lives, was cleared. He sent Dreher and Kowalski to the east side of the summit to establish an observation post. He positioned his 4 remaining automatic weapons, 2 BARs and 2 captured German MG-42s, at the compass points of the summit perimeter. He organized his 31 men, exhausted, some wounded, all running low on ammunition, into a defensive position on ground they had just taken by attacking up it. He called for resupply on his radio. Static. The radio wasn't damaged. The antenna was intact. The battery was charged. The signal simply wasn't reaching through the forest and the terrain to the battalion CP below. He tried again. More static. He looked at the men around him. He said, "We hold this." Nobody argued. The first German counterattack came from the east at 8:27 a.m. A company-strength force, approximately 80 men from the 272nd Volksgrenadier Division, had been waiting in the forest at the base of the hill for exactly this moment. Their orders were simple: if the summit falls, retake it. They came up the east slope with the same grim determination that the Rangers had used on the south slope an hour earlier, except they had numbers, and they were coming up a slope they knew. Dreher saw them first from the observation post. He counted. He stopped counting at 40 and got on the radio to Williams. East slope, company strength, 8 minutes. 8 minutes to the summit. Williams looked at his 31 men. He had to make a decision. He could try to hold the full perimeter and risk being overwhelmed everywhere simultaneously, or he could concentrate. He concentrated. He pulled everyone to the east side. He put all 4 automatic weapons facing east. He told the men with grenades to hold them until the Germans were within 30 meters.
He accepted that the west and south and north sides of the summit were now undefended. He was betting the Germans would come from one direction. If they came from two, it was over.
They came from one direction, at first. The German company hit the east side of the summit at 8:35 a.m. and was stopped cold. 4 automatic weapons firing simultaneously into an assault force on a slope, the same geometry that had made the German defense so devastating during the Ranger assault, produced carnage. The lead German element went down almost completely in the first 60 seconds. The second element hesitated. Williams was counting rounds, counting men, counting seconds. His 2 BARs were running hot. The automatic rifles that were the backbone of American squad-level fire superiority had a bad habit under sustained fire of jamming. One jammed at the 90-second mark. The gunner cleared it in 8 seconds, 8 seconds that felt like a week, and resumed firing. The German assault stalled at 30 meters below the summit. They pulled back. Williams allowed himself 2 seconds of something that wasn't quite relief. Then Dreher's voice came from the observation post. "West slope, movement!" The second German force was smaller, a platoon, perhaps 30 men, but they were coming from the direction Williams had left undefended. He had 60 seconds. He split his men. Half stayed on the east side, half sprinted to the west. Dreher sprinted to the west. He arrived at the west edge of the summit as the first German helmet appeared over the lip. What followed was not a firefight, it was a collision. The Ranger who arrived at the west edge first, Private First Class Marcus Webb, a 20-year-old from Georgia, who would receive the Silver Star for what he did next and spend 60 years insisting he didn't deserve it, ran directly at the first German who crested the summit and used the butt of his rifle to knock him back down the slope. Then he threw himself flat, and the Rangers behind him opened fire over him. The German platoon, half over the summit and half still climbing, caught in exactly the worst possible position, took devastating fire for 40 seconds, and broke. They ran back down the west slope. Webb stood up. He was shaking. Not from fear, he would say later. From the cold. He wasn't sure if he believed that himself.
Williams had 31 Rangers. He now had 22. 9 men were out of the fight. 3 dead, 6 wounded badly enough that they couldn't effectively contribute to the defense. Kowalski was one of them, a grenade fragment in his right shoulder that had taken his rifle arm mostly out of service. He was sitting against the bunker wall, holding his arm and still watching his sector. The ammunition situation was critical. The BARs were down to their last 3 magazines each. The captured MG-42s had been fired until the barrels were glowing, literally glowing orange in the cold air, and they needed to cool before they could fire accurately again. Williams' personal count of grenades, 4. He had started with 12. He needed resupply. He still had no radio contact with the battalion CP. He sent a runner. A single Ranger, Private Roy Haskell, 21 years old from Vermont, went over the south edge of the summit and down the slope, alone, with a message and the instruction to run and not stop. Williams watched him go and did not expect to see him again. He had sent the runner because he was out of options, not because he thought it would work. Then he turned back to his men. "East slope again," Dreher's voice. Williams closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them. "East perimeter, move." The 3rd German counterattack, the largest, a full company reinforced by elements of a second company, perhaps 120 men, began at 9:10 a.m. This time, the Germans did something different. They came from 2 directions simultaneously, east and south. Williams had 22 men. He could not split them again and expect to stop anything. He understood with complete clarity that what was about to happen was going to be decided in the next 4 minutes. Not by tactics, not by training, by will. Dreher took the east side with 11 men. Williams took the south side with 11 men. What happened in the next 4 minutes and 20 seconds, the time it took the German forces to reach the summit from 2 directions, was captured in fragments by the Rangers who survived it. No complete account exists because no one had the luxury of watching all of it. Dreher fired his Thompson until it was empty, dropped it, drew his .45, fired that until the slide locked back,
picked up a dead German's Schmeisser, the MP-40 submachine gun, found it empty, reversed it, and used it as a club. He was fighting men from a unit that was equal to him in training and commitment and courage, men who had crossed a continent to be on this hill and were not going to yield it without taking everything that could be taken. He cracked the Schmeisser stock against something. He did not look at what he had hit. He kept moving. Williams, on the south side, was doing the mathematics of ammunition consumption with the part of his brain that didn't shut off in combat. 11 men, roughly 60 meters of summit edge to cover. German forces advancing up a slope, slower than flat ground, less accurate under fire, but large enough that the sheer weight of numbers was going to matter in the next 60 seconds. He had 3 grenades left. He threw all 3 in rapid succession, spacing them wide across the German advance. The gaps the grenades opened were closed by the men behind them. He fired. His men fired. They were yelling, not orders, just sound, the primal noise of men at their absolute limit, using volume as a weapon because there was nothing else left. And then, the German advance stopped. Not because the Rangers broke it, because Haskell reached the battalion CP, because the battalion commander immediately got on the divisional artillery net, because the artillery that had been unavailable for the past 90 minutes, repositioned, redirected, now finally ranged on the slopes of Hill 400, opened up. Not on the summit, on the slopes where the German reinforcements were still moving up. The shells landed at 9:14 a.m., 4 minutes and 30 seconds after the third counterattack began. The German forces on the slopes broke under the bombardment and pulled back into the forest. The forces that had already reached the summit edge, perhaps 20 men, were suddenly without reinforcement, without momentum, alone at the top of a hill with 22 Rangers who had nothing left to lose. They pulled back. Not in rout, in the controlled, professional withdrawal of men who understood that tactical reality had changed and would fight again from a better position. But they pulled back.
Hill 400 fell silent at 9:19 a.m. Bill Dreher stood at the eastern edge of the summit. His hands were shaking, not from cold. He looked down the slope he had climbed 90 minutes ago. He counted the marks in the snow where men had gone down and not gotten up. He stopped counting. He turned back to the summit. 22 Rangers standing on a hill they had been told couldn't be taken. 85 men went up. 22 were standing when it ended. They held what nobody thought they could take. And then they held it again and again. Against everything sent to push them off, they held. The contradiction at the center of this story was this: 85 men against a fortified position held by elite troops. That shouldn't work. The math doesn't support it. Military doctrine, the doctrine that professional officers study and professional armies execute, says that to successfully assault a fortified position, you need at minimum 3 attackers for every defender, preferably more, plus artillery, plus air support, plus engineering support to deal with obstacles. The Rangers had roughly equivalent numbers to the defenders. They had limited artillery and no air support. They had no engineering support. They had no margin for anything to go wrong. Everything went wrong, and they still took Hill 400. The resolution of that contradiction is not a tactical mystery. The tactics were sound as they could be given the limitations. Williams planned correctly, adjusted correctly, made the right calls at the right moments. But tactics don't fully explain it. What fully explains it is something that can't be quantified. The willingness at the moment when every rational calculation said stop, to keep moving, to be the man who keeps moving when stopping is the reasonable choice. That willingness, cultivated by months of training, refined by months of combat, expressed in its purest form on 40 meters of frozen slope under machine gun fire, is what took Hill 400. The aftermath was devastating in numbers. Of the 85 Rangers who started the assault, 58 were killed, wounded, or missing by the end of the day. 58 men out of 85, a 68% casualty rate. This number needs to be held, not processed, not contextualized, not compared to other battles, just held. 68%. Of the 27 who came through relatively unscathed, nearly all had wounds they hadn't reported: cuts, burns, blast injuries, bruising from hand-to-hand fighting that they had wrapped with their own bandages and kept moving through. The unwounded wasn't quite the right word.
The still standing was more accurate. Sergeant Bill Dreher received the Silver Star for his actions on Hill 400. He was not present at the ceremony because by the time the paperwork cleared, he was in a field hospital in Belgium with a leg wound from the 3rd German counterattack that he had not reported until after the hill was secured. He had known the wound was there. He had made the decision to deal with it later. Later, when the men beside him still needed him standing. He went home to Findlay, Ohio in November 1945. He never farmed. He worked at the county courthouse for 30 years, processing property records. A man whose most intense professional experience had involved climbing a frozen hill under fire, spending his career in a quiet office, moving paper. His children would later describe him as patient, methodical, a man who never seemed rattled by anything. They did not, for most of his life, know why. Sergeant Randall Oakes, the squad leader who climbed on a bullet-holed leg, was evacuated from Hill 400 on the afternoon of December 7th. The wound required surgery and 3 months of recovery. He was offered a medical discharge. He refused it. He returned to the 2nd Ranger Battalion in March 1945 and was present for the end of the war in Germany. He went home to Indiana and went back to coaching high school football. His players for 30 years heard him say one thing repeatedly in practice, the thing he said whenever a drill became difficult, whenever the physical effort exceeded what the players thought they could produce. "You don't know what you can do yet." He said it so often, it became a kind of legend in the local school system. A simple phrase that coaches in that county repeated for decades without knowing where it came from, without knowing what hill it had come from, what slope it had been proven on.
What happened on Hill 400 on December 7, 1944, was not strategically decisive. It's important to say. The Hurtgen Forest campaign itself has been criticized by historians as a strategic blunder, an attritional battle fought in the worst possible terrain for limited objectives that could have been achieved by other means. Hill 400 was won, and then in the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge that began 9 days later, the strategic picture shifted so dramatically that the specific value of the hill, those eyes over the Roar River Valley, temporarily receded in importance. Men died for a hill that the war moved past faster than anyone expected. This is also important to say, not to diminish what they did, but because one of the cruelest facts of war is that bravery and sacrifice don't always align neatly with strategic impact. The two things, how hard something was, how much it cost, exist independently of how much it ultimately mattered on a map. What Hill 400 mattered for was something the maps couldn't show. It mattered because it was proof. Proof of a specific, uncomfortable, necessary truth about what human beings are capable of when they commit to something completely. The modern Ranger Regiment traces its lineage directly to the 2nd Ranger Battalion. Every Ranger who has graduated from Ranger School since 1944, every soldier who has pinned the tan beret, every man and woman who has gone through the 61-day selection process that produces Rangers today, carries something from December 7, 1944, in the institutional DNA of the unit. They don't all know the specific story, but they know the standard. Rangers lead the way. Not when conditions are favorable, when conditions are impossible. That's what the motto means. That's what it has always meant. And it means it because of what Bill Dreher and Randall Oakes and James Kiefer and Marcus Webb and Roy Haskell and 27 others did on a frozen hill in the Hurtgen Forest on the 3rd anniversary of Pearl Harbor. This is what it cost to take that hill. Not numbers, not strategy, men. If that means something to you, don't just watch, subscribe, and help keep these stories alive.
Private Roy Haskell, the runner Williams sent down the slope with no expectation of return, made it to the battalion CP. He delivered the message. He received orders to return to the summit with the resupply information. He went back up, alone. Up the slope he had just come down, under fire that had not, in the intervening 20 minutes, particularly diminished. He made it. He handed Williams the message. Williams read it, looked up, said, "Good man." Haskell nodded. Then he went to his position and resumed fighting. He had 7 more years to live. A car accident in 1951 would take him from Vermont, and from a wife and a daughter who missed him for the rest of their lives. He was 28 years old when he died, and he had gone up that hill twice in one morning and never mentioned it to anyone who didn't already know. That's the part of the story that doesn't have a clean ending. That's the part the history books find hardest to include, because the men who do the impossible don't always get the rest of the life they were promised. Hill 400 still stands. The Hurtgen Forest has grown back. The shell craters have softened into gentle depressions that look, if you don't know what made them, like natural features of the landscape. The bunker positions have been reclaimed by roots and moss and 80 years of weather. If you climb Hill 400 today, and you can, it is not a protected military site, just a hill in a forest in western Germany, you will notice the slope. You will notice it halfway up when your legs begin to complain and your lungs begin to protest, and you are moving in good boots on a clear day with no one shooting at you. You will notice it, and you will think, they did this under fire. They did this with men going down around them. They did this not knowing if the man behind them was still alive. They did this knowing what waited at the top. And they kept moving. That is the Ranger way. Not because it is easy, because it is necessary. Because someone has to go first. Because someone has to climb the hill that the plan says can't be climbed. And when that moment comes, in any life, in any form, the question is always the same. Are you still moving? Bill Dreher was asked once at a Ranger reunion in 1987 what he remembered most about Hill 400. He thought for a long time. Then he said, the slope, just the slope. The feeling of climbing and not knowing, and just climbing anyway. He paused. That feeling never really goes away, he said, and I've decided that's probably a good thing. Rangers lead the way. They always have. December 7th, 1944 is why those words mean what they mean. Subscribe, like, comment. If this story moved you, share it. These Rangers are still climbing that hill. The least we can do is make sure the world knows they were there. Next time, the bridge at Remagen, how one German soldier's hesitation changed the entire course of the war in 12 seconds.